Since at least 2016, the presence of foreign disinformation in American politics, and especially on our social media platforms, has been well understood. But today's guest says different state actors like Russia and China behave differently online depending on their own goals. He's Clemson University scholar Darren Linvill this week on Story in the Public Square. Hello and welcome to Story in the Public Square, where storytelling meets public affairs. I'm Jim Ludis from the Pell Center at Salve Regina University.
And I'm G. Wayne Miller, also with Salve's Pell Center.
And our guest this week is Dr. Darren Linvill, Associate Professor of Communications at Clemson University. He's also the co-director of the school's Media Forensics Hub, where he studies social media, disinformation, and its impact on the public square. He joins us today from South Carolina. Darren, it's great to be with you again.
Well, thanks for having me, Jim. It's good to be back.
You know, so you're a researcher who studies the health and the integrity of the information Americans receive largely on social media. On this eve of a major American election, what's your overall assessment of the quality of that information this year?
My overall assessment is, frankly, that I'm not going to get a lot of sleep before the election. Because the quality of the overall information could use a little work. It's hard to say at this point if it's, measurably worse than it's been in years past, largely because of what effect AI may have had on the larger digital ecosystem. But we're still not in a terribly healthy place.
Do you have a sense of the sources of that pollution, as it were?
Yeah, I mean, it's anyone that is out to make a buck or gain influence at the end of the day. And, some of those sources are domestic, but most of the work we do here at Clemson focuses on foreign actors, the sort of disinformation that's coming from China, Iran, and of course, Russia.
So you and your colleagues at Clemson have studied something called narrative laundering. Can you tell us what it is and who is using it?
Yeah. Narrative laundering is the process of planting a piece of information, a story or a narrative, and then putting it out in the world in such a way as to mask its origin, to mask where it comes from, so that it enters the common discourse, enters everyday conversation among real people, without anybody really understanding where it originated. The Russians are the, original masters of this. They quite famously, back in the mid-'80s, planted a story in an Indian newspaper that they actually ran, that the CIA was responsible for the AIDS virus, that it had been created at Fort Detrick here in the United States. And then over years, they took that story that was originally planted in India and they disseminated it around the world, to the point where even today, many people believe around the globe that the CIA created the AIDS virus. They do very much, the Russians do very much the same thing today, but new technology, digital technology, and especially social media has made tactics that, in days gone by took weeks, months, and years into things that can happen in just days. It's not just the Russians, of course. We've seen hints that the Iranians are also engaging in narrative laundering, and the Chinese as well.
Can you give a couple more examples of narrative laundering today? I mean, the historical perspective was great, but give a couple of examples of things that come to mind that might be prominent that people, quote unquote, swallowed.
Yeah, so we've been following a particular Russian campaign that our team here at Clemson first publicly identified in November of last year, and that Microsoft subsequently named Storm 1516. And this is a campaign where the Russians will plant a story on YouTube, oftentimes, or other social media platforms, and then they'll layer that story by using foreign media outlets, often in West Africa or the Arab-speaking world, and then finally through Western-facing media outlets that they've created themselves using AI. The original website that they built was called DC Weekly. So this was a fake news page that was constantly updated with content that looked authentic. It looked real. It looked like a reasonable website that you would get your news from, and then it's disseminated into the natural discourse across social media. Sometimes using Russian-leaning accounts or accounts in the employment of Russia, sometimes through well-meaning, innocent dupes on the internet. And stories that they've spread this way have, in the past year, largely been about Ukraine. A lot of stories suggesting that Zelensky is corrupt, that his regime is corrupt, that they're using Western aid money to purchase villas in Germany and Egypt. And one particular story that really took off was a story that supposedly came from an Egyptian journalist about Zelensky purchasing 2 yachts worth $75 million combined. This was a story that, before the Russians planted this story in November, nobody was using the word Zelensky and yacht in the same sentence anywhere in the digital world. But after November, tens of thousands of people were doing so, even today, to the point where even thought leaders were spreading this story, and decision makers, including now Vice Presidential candidate J.D. Vance.
So it begs the question, how can, the quote-unquote ordinary citizen or resident differentiate between fake news and real news? I mean, what tools would someone like me, for example, have to look at a story like that and conclude, not real?
Yeah, it's exceedingly difficult, because what we need to remember is that the people who are engaging in this kind of activity are professionals, and they are really good at their job. They know what they're doing. These websites that they're building are they look authentic. They have the look and feel of a real news site. Both the Russians and Iranians have been building web pages that look absolutely natural and part of the regular digital ecosystem. So it's exceedingly difficult for everyday citizens to really be confident when they're seeing some new page on the internet, to know with confidence that it's genuine and that the information that they're sharing is genuine. So I think it's important, especially in these months before a major election, that people get their news and information from sources that they trust, that they've visited before, pages that they know have a history, whether that's a news outlet in their own community or on the national level.
Darren, you mentioned these websites like DC Weekly. I think some of the others were like the Chicago Chronicle, the Miami Chronicle, the New York News Daily. I was on a panel last week at the McCain Institute talking about disinformation, and somebody from the Cronkite School pointed out that those sites in particular, these fake sites that are just vehicles for Russian disinformation, are actually smoother, slicker, better-looking news websites than an actual newspaper ever would look, because they are engineered to be totally digital, where newspapers are, Wayne, former journalists who are trying to put together something online, and that difference she thought was a bit of a tell. But let me ask you this question. You've written and studied extensively about the role that nation states play in fomenting disinformation and spreading it. Do the tactics and techniques that different nation states adopt, are they different? And if they are, why?
Oh, there's no question that they're different. And I think the reasons they're different come down to the goals a combination of things. One, the goals that those nation states have in what they're trying to accomplish, but also the nation state's own history. So if we look at, for instance, Russia and China and how their tactics differ, Russia has a long history, going back to the the days of the KGB, of active measures, like this story I was telling about America creating the AIDS virus. That was an idea that they were promoting. They planted that story, very carefully crafted it, and spread it in a very purposeful way. They were promoting an idea, and they have a history of doing that. It's what's called Putin's fire hose of falsehoods. They promote so many different narratives on a topic that sometimes you don't know what to believe. And that's what they're good at. And so that's the way that they engage in disinformation today. Whereas if you look at China, China has a history of tight control over their media, especially at home. I mean, Russia does this as well, but China is famous for it. I mean, try to have a conversation on Chinese social media about Tiananmen Square. It can't be done. Try to even post a photo of Winnie the Pooh in China, and you can't, because Winnie the Pooh apparently looks a little too much like President Xi. And that is the same sort of approach, that tight control, that is the same sort of approach that China takes to the wider Western digital ecosystem. They want to control messages about China abroad in the same way that they do at home. And so they try to suppress specific narratives. They try to demote messages rather than promote messages. And so at the end of the day, the tactics look very different than what Russia tries to do.
So, Darren, I have to say that you stopped me at Winnie the Pooh. I did not know that. I believe it, of course. I want to get back to, you mentioned YouTube has a lot of videos from bad actors. What responsibility do the platforms like YouTube, like Facebook, like Twitter, or now we call it X, what responsibility do they have to vet these?
I mean, legally, very little. But morally, of course, I think quite a lot. At the end of the day, platforms are moderation machines. We don't like to think of them in that way. But companies are in the business of moderation. They moderate content to give us what we want, what we're looking for, so that we'll come back to that platform and use it more and more. But they also moderate content to keep it safe and reliable, because as much as people like to say that maybe they're not in favor of moderation, your typical user, in other words, the person that platform is trying to get to return to their platform over and over again and get to be a part of that platform, typical user, doesn't want to have a lot of scams inundated with them. They don't want to be attacked by violent language. They don't want to see garbage on the platform. They don't want to be overwhelmed by things like pornography that people might be trying to sell on the platform. And so, it really is in the best interest of the platforms to maintain content that is both what the users want and is safe, because at the end of the day, that's also what the users want. So I think that there is a moral responsibility, as well as an economic agenda at work here for the platforms to give users content that is both useful and safe.
So, Darren, this year, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the head of the U.S. intelligence community, has been issuing a series of reports with their partners from CISA, from the National Security Agency, the FBI, all the intelligence agencies combined, documenting and alerting the public to the ways in which governments hostile to the United States are trying to influence America's elections. Let's maybe walk through some of those key players, and let's start with Russia. What's Russia's hand in the 2024 election?
Russia seems to be focused on supporting Donald Trump and undermining the Harris-Walz ticket. I think this is largely because they're very focused on Ukraine, and they see that I think it's likely that they see a Democratic president being more likely to continue to support Zelensky and Ukraine in the ongoing war. Because, we've seen for the past couple of years now, since the start of the full-scale invasion, uh, Russian influence operations squarely focused on Ukraine. So I think it makes a lot of sense for them in that context to support the Trump campaign and in the upcoming election. We've seen them do that even already in a variety of ways, both through various stories that they've engaged in narrative laundering with, and through a large bot army that they use through a campaign called Doppelganger.
And I think just because, I think that there's some people might hear that statement and say, oh, that's just partisanship itself. How do we know? How can we attribute the stuff that you're seeing through the Media Forensics Hub back to Russia, and to be able to draw that conclusion that Russia appears to be supporting the candidacy of former President Donald Trump?
Sure. Well, first of all, it's not just us. When we do make an attribution, it's something we don't do lightly. It's something we don't do often, but it is something we are very, very careful about. And it's a series of connecting the dots. I'm not talking about sitting here in my office with yarn on a wall. I'm talking about a very careful process of connecting what we know with what we know from other sources as well, and what we know about ongoing Russian operations. But it's definitely not just us who have attributed ongoing campaigns to Russia. It's been corporations like Microsoft, it's been the DOJ, it's been other government agencies and other governments as well that have all attributed various campaigns, even recently, to ongoing Russian disinformation.
So, Darren, what is China's ambition in terms of this year's election? What are they hoping to achieve?
China, especially when it comes to U.S. elections, typically is focused more down ballot. China really cares about China at the end of the day. Russia might care what you think about your neighbor. They engage in some sort of offensive influence operations. China's operations tend to be more defensive in nature. So they focus on issues like, what are people saying about Xinjiang and the suppression of the Uyghur people in northwest China? What are people saying about Taiwan or Hong Kong? They're very focused on these issues that really matter to China. And in that same way, they sometimes target particular politicians who are down ballot politicians, senators, representatives that are particularly critical of China.
The last country that the ODNI has been talking about is Iran. And you said to me yesterday that Iran is really sort of just pulling a page from the Russian playbook. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. They have taken the same sort of tactics that Russia used in 2016 and 2020, using fake social media profiles, and now using fake websites for the purposes of narrative laundering, and they're using those same tactics to promote specific agenda. We've seen a lot of the disinformation recently focused on conversations around the ongoing war in Gaza. That's not surprising, considering their relationship with Hamas. But they have also are clearly favoring the Harris-Walz ticket in the upcoming U.S. election.
Interesting.
Iran probably sees that as to potentially in their benefit. In the past, one could argue that they've gotten a better deal out of Democratic presidents than Republican presidents, and so they may see a Harris presidency as being in their benefit, and they have in turn attacked Trump. So they're sort of using the same tactics as Russia, but with an opposite agenda in the U.S. election.
Interesting. So those are nation states. Are there non-state actors active in this space too? It would seem to me like the barrier to entry for these kinds of campaigns has fallen just the way they have fallen for businesses and small organizations as well. Do you see non-state actors in this space as well?
There's no question that we see activity that we think is likely due to non-state actors. You're absolutely right about the barrier of entry falling. AI has made engaging in social media disinformation operations much cheaper. Not necessarily better at the end of the day, but you can, create a lot of content and put it out fast using artificial intelligence and large language models. And we have recently identified a network of accounts targeting several Democratic Senate or several Senate races that there's no reason for me to believe that it's a state actor because of who they're targeting and how they're targeting both the left and the right sort of interchangeably, as though they are, working for pay. Whoever's got the deepest pockets.
That's fascinating.
So far we've been talking about America, but there have been elections in many other countries around the world this year. What has been the experience of those countries in terms of narrative laundering and disinformation? I'm assuming that some of them have been targeted too.
Yeah, well, I am a real believer that, as much as we talk about disinformation in the West and the United States specifically, it's a much bigger problem for the rest of the globe, especially in countries that don't speak English, because the platforms, they just don't care. They're not trying to monitor conversations in a lot of other countries, especially Africa, Southeast Asia. And the biggest perpetrator of some of these campaigns is nation states' own governments targeting their own people for social control. Russia, in fact, first got its start in social media disinformation operations targeting their own people. Russia was targeting Russians a couple of years before they ever started targeting the West and targeting the United States. And we see this, in the rest of the globe. Venezuela has a huge propaganda and influence operation targeting their own people. We recently here at Clemson wrote a report about an ongoing campaign connected to the Rwandan government, targeting conversations about Rwanda and especially the Rwandan people. So there's no question this is a global issue, and it is especially a domestic issue. Show me an autocrat in the globe, and I'll show you somebody running a disinformation operation targeting their own people.
Yeah. So, Darren, I have a little side hustle, and it's called the Active Measures newsletter and podcast.
I'm a fan.
You're a fan, and you've been featured in it several times. And we try to capture the best reporting each week about disinformation campaigns, political warfare, active measures globally. One of the things that we've been coming back to repeatedly, though, is this question of whether or not, in just talking about this, we make it worse, or whether or not there's a temptation to overstate the impact and the effectiveness of disinformation. Where do you come down on that debate?
That's a conversation we've had a lot. In fact, it's been a concern of mine since day one of studying disinformation. By talking about Russian disinformation, am I doing exactly what Putin wants me to do? Because at the end of the day, one of the biggest effects of disinformation is that, we sort of have this doubt of all information. Because I know, Russians are putting lies out on the internet, I'm more likely to stop and question any, real argument or real person making an argument. And, maybe I can believe that what you're saying isn't true, not because, you believe something different than me and have a reasonable other perspective about the world, but because you're not even a real person. You're just a bot. So I can completely dismiss you. So those are real effects. But, that doesn't mean that we should stop talking about it or ignore it. I mean, I'm biased, of course. I study this, and this is how I make a living. But I didn't always, and I started doing it because I thought it was important. Facts and the truth are fundamental for us making good decisions about politics, good decisions about the world around us, good decisions about what direction we're gonna go forward in a shared society. So I don't think you're going to win the war on disinformation by ignoring disinformation. But you're right that we also shouldn't give it too much power. I've lost track of the number of emails I've gotten from journalists and regular people on the street asking, "Hey, is this account?" And they'll send me a link. "Is this account a Russian troll?" And it never is. Most accounts on the internet are real. Most people that you engage with on the internet are real. Maybe they look funny. Maybe they believe something different than you do, but that doesn't mean that they are a Russian troll.
Hey, we've got about 30 seconds left. In the last couple of weeks of the campaign, what should Americans be tuned to about the information they're consuming? Literally 30 seconds. Yeah.
I think that they need to treat the digital world just like they treat the real world. If you're at the cashiers, at the grocery store, and you see a newspaper with a headline that is too big to be believed, like "Elvis lives," we know not to trust those. We know to treat them with a certain amount of doubt, and we don't always have that same doubt in the digital world. We need to treat the digital world as though it is the real world, because it is.
That's a great place for us to leave it. Darren Linvill, the Media Forensics Hub at Clemson University, thank you for spending some time with us this week. That is all the time we have. If you want to know more about storing the public square, you can find us on social media or visit pellcenter.org, where you can always catch up on previous episodes. For G. Wayne Miller, I'm Jim Ludis. Ask you to join us again next time for more Story in the Public Square.